as a way to say the judiciary, you do need to be more independent. You should not always defer to an agency. And so that's what the basis of the bill that we passed. And like Nino said, it's just a couple of lines. I think the only thing we added is that if the judges go through all the statute of construction, all the things that they should do in looking at a question, defer to liberty. If in the end you still are unsure, defend individual liberty and decide in favor of the individual and not for the agency.
Welcome to ALEC's annual meeting. It's 2026 annual meeting here in Orlando, Florida. We have a special panel here of the Judiciary Task Force. You guys have just released a report. First of all, Nino Marchese and State Majority Leader in the Senate of Oklahoma, Julie Daniels.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. I know you, Julie, you've been on the Judiciary Committee in your state, and now you're on the Judiciary Task Force here at ALEC. And so this report is available online at alec.org. Judicial deference reformed. How states are reclaiming judicial autonomy from bureaucratic influence. Nino, go over sort of the premise behind the report and just a little bit of an executive summary of it, if you don't mind.
Sure, absolutely. So we had a number of states become interested in reforming their judicial deference laws. And so essentially judicial deference is this doctrine, regardless if it's codified in judicial opinion or state statute, that prohibits judges from interpreting the law, and instead they have to adopt the interpretations that bureaucrats have on the law when there's a case in their court. And so we have a model policy, the Judicial Deference Reform Act, which is basically a two-sentence prohibition on that practice, requires judges to utilize their exclusive authority to interpret the law. And we've seen a number of states implement this model policy and reform their deference practices and restore that exclusive interpretory authority to their judiciaries. And so we wanted to highlight all the action that's been going on in the states. There's been some federal news that went out that kind of accelerated this movement. But as of right now, about 15 states have adopted this model policy. And so we wanted this report to kind of highlight the issue generally, what judicial deference is, lay it out, show people why they should care, why it's important. And inspire them to follow in the footsteps of the many states at ALEC that have reformed their laws on the issue.
How's Oklahoma doing in this area?
Well, it took us 2 or 3 sessions, but we got it passed last year. A lot of people don't understand the issue because most legislators really aren't aware of the administrative state and administrative law and all the rules and regulations that we should have oversight over, but we sort of leave it to others, and that's how the executive agencies get more and more powers because we're looking the other way. And so this was a way to say the judiciary, you do need to be more independent. You should not always defer to an agency. And so that's what the basis of the bill that we passed. And like Nino said, it's just a couple of lines. I think the only thing we added is that if the judges go through all the statute of construction, all the things that they should do in looking at a question, defer to liberty. If in the end you still are unsure, defend individual liberty and decide in favor of the individual and not for the agency.
This seems fairly commonsensical, You think a judge would go back and review the law, make their decisions based on, past precedents to some degree and not have too many outside influences as they look at various cases, but that isn't what was happening?
Yeah, and I think sometimes they were unaware of it. And it certainly wasn't to tell them that you may not defer. It was just that you don't automatically defer.
Right.
And you also need to look at, when you're deferring, did they have the statutory or constitutional authority to even have the rule that they are interpreting a certain way? And so it was really to say to the judiciary, you need to do your job better, and we're going to advise you that you need to do that. And it also applies to administrative law judges.
Right.
So all those hearings that take place that nobody knows about, where the individual citizen is pushing back against the swamp, for better or worse, this said to the judiciary, you have to be more careful about whose interpretation you adopt in making a decision.
You heard from the state Senate leader here, Julie Daniels in Oklahoma, how it took her a number of times to get this through. What's holding up the rollout, and what are you saying to the state legislators that this model policy, how do they get it through their own state acts?
Sure, I think the biggest hang-up is just ignorance on the issue itself. States are unaware what it is, what deference is. And a lot of states are unaware of how these administrative hearings and procedures end up in a courtroom and then kind of what's going on. And so the message that I share with state legislators when I go and I testify in support of these bills and I speak to legislators about it. I break it down as a fundamental structural separation of powers matter. You know, the legislative branch, they legislate, they create laws, the executive branch enforces, the judicial branch adjudicates, and part of adjudication is interpreting the law, having the power to interpret the law. Judicial deference says, judges, you're not allowed to read and interpret that law. You're not allowed, you have to interpret whatever that unelected bureaucrat said. And when I say that, then people get it. Right? They start listening, they get it, they understand. It's like, oh, okay, judges should be able to judge. It's like, yes, that's all this is. That's what we're talking about. Let's get back to baseline, fundamental co-equal branches of government, let judges adjudicate cases, right? And when you prohibit deference, by the way, you're not saying they're not allowed to end up where their honorable, respective state agencies ended up, and how they see the law and what they should be. They can end up there in that same place and implement whatever they want. Prohibiting deference just says we're untying the hands of judges. You're not required to defer to somebody that you might disagree with.
So, were there some egregious examples in your state that you looked at, any case studies that shot out and said this needs to be changed? Just put it in sort of an example for someone as uninformed as I am.
Sure. So I think the biggest examples that you saw with negative or bad consequences coming out of deference was at the federal level. Federal administrative agencies have been growing for decades. We see a lot of kind of the most bureaucratic, stifling red tape at the federal level. And so in the federal courts, judges' hands were tied and bureaucrats kind of knew that. So you have administration waves come in, and then you see regulators come in. They know that their interpretations of law are going to be held up in court ultimately, and so you saw an encroachment and an extension of the scope of what Congress would authorize bureaucrats to actually do. And we can talk about different EPA regulations, environmental regulations, fiscal regulations. At the end of the day, I think the biggest, the most impactful things came at the federal level. That's not to say there aren't horror stories in the states. I think the biggest problem in the states, though, is that regardless of what a certain state's law may say, deference is prohibited, deference is allowed in these circumstances, deference is, whatever, the majority of states actually inconsistently apply their deference laws. So there's a difference between what the text says, what the law is on paper, and then what actually happens in court and practice. And most states are not consistently upholding their doctrines. And so that's really, I'd say, the biggest consequence, negative effect. It's a gamble if you're going to court. If you're challenging a state administrative regulation, or if you're, being fined or prosecuted even, you kind of don't know where judges are going to be in most of the states.
What Nino said about understanding at the federal level, it's judicial deference, but we all know it as the Chevron doctrine, which was a couple of decades ago when the Supreme Court said that you will defer to the agencies. So we all knew that Chevron was a bad thing, and we wanted to repeal that at the state level. The other thing that's interesting in terms of pushback, some industries who had accommodated the agencies and understood their interpretation of long-standing rules were now afraid that the judges would no longer defer, and it would literally upset the regulatory apple cart. They like consistency, they like being able to rely on rules, so there was this pattern of practice. We know how they're going to interpret that rule, and now suddenly, Senator Daniels and her colleagues are saying, oh, no, the Judiciary should take an independent look at that. So we got a little pushback, but not enough to not get it passed. And the other part that occurred to me and my colleagues are learning more about is so many of these administrative law judges actually work for the agency. So you have the agency is both the prosecutor, the jury, and the judge. And so even more important that the judiciary should not defer. So it was telling these ALJs, look, you may be hired by the agency, but you have a responsibility to the people of the state of Oklahoma to not always defer.
So it's sort of like if they think you broke a regulation, you're guilty until you prove yourself innocent.
That's exactly true.
Right. What's your recommendation and advice for other state legislators that are here? How would they be able to push this through their states? I'll start with you.
Well, I'm encouraged. What'd you say, 28 states have done it? I'm going to guess that it's easier to pass in a red state than a blue state. So I would first look at my sister fellow red states and see, have you done this yet? I think knowing that business did push back on it a little bit in Oklahoma, that might be a consideration. And sometimes I think some attorneys, trial bar, they're a little more comfortable with big government than I am, and so you might have to overcome those sorts of objections. And then it's just instructing your colleague, educating them that we have this responsibility. Ultimately, this oversight is ours, and we need to make sure that the citizens we represent get a fair shake. So that's the reason you should do it.
And Nino, they can always contact you at ALEC, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody wants to learn more about the issue generally, or if you need help or support in your state with the issue, just reach out to ALEC and we'll be there for you.
And you can download the report now on the ALEC.org website, Judicial Deference Reform. Thank you, Nino Marchese of the Task Force on the Judiciary at ALEC. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Majority Leader in Oklahoma, Julie Daniels. We're here at the 2026 ALEC Annual Meeting in Orlando, Florida.